Uh, Good evening. I am here with John Manzo, President of the State Council from 1990 to 2000. You even
No,
got
no, 99 to 2000.
1999 to 2000. Even got pictures of you.
Oh, God help me.
I have to tell you, I was looking at a lot of pictures from the council, and we looked awfully funny when we were younger.
And we looked younger when we were young.
I know. I actually had brown hair.
Crazy.
Uh, so when you joined the State Council, were you a staff member, a student, a management? What?
I joined the council when I was a resident at Montefiore. So that was like in 1984, 85. Um, I remember a lot of buzz and excitement because Marvin Liu, who was the one of the associate directors at Montefiore at the time, was being installed as president. So that was the first year I joined.
Okay. And who did you meet that made you want to move on and do more?
Um, well, it probably took a few years for that to happen because after my residency, I got my doctorate in Buffalo. So I was in Buffalo for 2 years, so from like whatever, 85 to 87. And then, kept in touch with the council, but not much. I mean, I went to the meetings, but, going to school wasn't doing much. It wasn't really until I started working as a clinical manager at Kingsbrook Jewish Medical Center with David Edelman, where I got a lot more involved with a few different things with the council. So that's really the person that I think, of course, Marvin and Kurt during my residency year were very much advocates of getting involved and participating, but I think it was really Dave who hooked me up with like the REF at the time. I was on the REF award selection committee for a couple years and got more involved with the council going to the House of Delegates. It might have been the first time I went to the House of Delegates was, when I was working with Dave at Kingsbrook.
Mhm.
And so that was really, he was probably a big catalyst. I left Kingsbrook after about 3 years and went back to Montefiore, works for Kurt Kleiman. And of course, Kurt was extremely supportive of continuing that, not only participation and relationship with the council, but even at the local level with the state, or I'm sorry, with the city society. So
Okay.
my first, really became director, I'm sorry, president of the city before I got on the board at the council level.
Okay. So I heard you mention Marvin, Dave, um, Kurt. How many presidents have you gotten to know? And did you meet any of the earlier ones?
Sure. Um, so there weren't that many around, probably, but of course, Bernie Mel, and you forgive me because I don't know if I remember all their names. Um, but between I guess Bernie and Marvin, I met those presidents. I'm trying to remember. I guess a lot of them after Marvin as well, as I was sort of the years between first getting involved with the council and then when I finally became president. So that was probably the decade of past presidents that I really knew the best.
Okay.
Everybody else, Tom O'Brien, of course, was very involved at the council at the time as well. So when I eventually got onto the board, Tom, I would say was definitely someone that I aligned with and learned a lot from, as well as like Jack Katrinas and not so much Susan Hunt, but definitely Jack and the people that kind of came after him.
Okay. Um, when I was talking with Norm, And I know that when you were on the council, when you were on the board, that there was budget activity. Norm Gallagher had said when he started, it was fully voluntary, so they were footing the bill for almost everything. Um, what challenges did you see as a member when you were a resident, as a board member, and as presidents for the organization?
Don't really remember too many challenges those first few years because again, I was not as engaged as I was after I came back from Buffalo. But in the early times before when I was just a member and then became a board member, I always remember that there were a lot of challenges around. There were some financial challenges, but I think there were many more challenges around the how the council was supported by an executive director. And, there was a lot of conversations beginning to happen around, do we have our own executive director, separate office? The transition of the executive secretary on the board. So all of those kinds of things, I think that was what I remember most before I became president while I was on the board is some of the challenges around how are we going to manage, um, or, organizational management, and there were 3 or 4 different changes while I was on the board and into my presidency
Mm-hmm.
where we, made a switch into having our own executive director that was paid staff. So that was a lot of the focus of the years I was on the board and leading up to my presidential year. I think the other thing that I remember being somewhat challenging is, um, there was a lot of upstate, downstate. How do we serve both parts of the states, our members in both parts of the states? How to be fair and equitable. I became involved. Another thing that Dave Edelman um, connected me with was the at the time. Remember, we had a mid-year clinical meeting,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a committee around that, and also then the assembly committee. So I got very involved with the mid-year clinical and the assembly. Chaired those meetings. Met probably that's where I began to meet a lot more people across the organization, not just at the board level. Um, and there was a lot of conversation at the time, as I said, around upstate, downstate, who felt like they were more slighted than another. And I think we spent a lot of time to try to be a lot very fair and equitable as far as like where we had meetings, where we were pulling members from, where we were pulling board members from. So those were some of the initial challenges while I was on the board before I was president.
Okay. Um, memberships has always seemed to be an issue. Do you remember what members wanted during your presidency?
Yeah, it's always right. We always try to understand what our members need or want. I mean, the big thing was, of course, continuing education, access to continuing education, and I think that was probably our focus with our meetings and with our outreach. Of course, way back then in the dark ages, we didn't have um, technology like we have now, where it's a lot easier to access that kind of programming. So it was always a challenge on how we bring that programming to our members across the state. And we did a lot of work to make sure that we were doing programs downstate. We were trying to leverage the same programs upstate or in other parts of the state. So I think that was probably one of the most important things for the membership. At the time, we didn't talk about it as much as we do now, but the whole concept of how we network and the value of networking for not only our advocacy initiatives, but in identifying future leaders of not only the organization, but our profession. So I think that's maybe shifted a little bit. But in the beginnings of when I got involved, it was more about, providing continuing education, making sure, I think at that time, mandatory CE I don't remember the exact year that happened in New York State, but we had been
1996.
okay. So we had been advocating for that for a long time while I was on the board before I
Mm-hmm.
became president. Um, so those were sort of the things that were mostly the focus at the time. And I
Okay.
know that we also were struggling with finances at the time as well, but I think that we had a lot more members then than we have now. Um, Dues were probably less than they are now, but I think that we were pretty much holding our head above water. I think soon after, into the 2000s, things changed quite a bit financially for the council, but I don't recall that was so much of our focus as much as we were trying to like identify what our members needed, wanted, and try to give it to them.
Okay. How often did the board meet?
Mm.
Was it organized? Was it professional? Was there camaraderie in the board meetings?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think we were meeting monthly or every other month. It was definitely much more frequently than the board meets now. The other big difference was that they were face-to-face meetings. Again, we didn't have Zoom, we didn't have technology other than phone calls that we could have, but the board met face-to-face 4, 5, 6 times a year, and I think that was a big. It was very different than what it is now. I mean, I think what we've lost is that camaraderie, is that networking. You know, there's no opportunity or very little opportunity for the board now to have those bonding experiences, to understand who everybody is, get to know people at a personal level. And I think that that's something that is unfortunate because I think that made a big difference in how we were able to be successful. When you work more closely with people, you are face to face with them, you're in the same room with them. The board meetings used to be like 2 days, day and
Hmm.
a half to 2 days. We'd have overnight, we'd have, dinner and opportunity in the evening to go out and just let our hair down. Um,
When we had it?
when we had it. And I think that's a big difference in the way our organization operates today. I've been fortunate over the last year in particular, on and off touching the board, but this last year, as being the chair of the DEI committee, our current president, Bob DiGregorio, asked me to sit in on the board meetings to sort of be the conscience of the board when it came to um, decisions we were making sure they were fair, equitable, etc. So what I've seen this year is, we had, I think two of the meetings were face to face, but the other ones have all been virtual. And and even the face to face ones are just 6 hours. So you go, we had a meeting in Binghamton, for example. We had one upstate, um, northeast part of the state. But you get there, you have the meeting, and you leave. So you don't really have that overnight opportunity to get to know people better and bond. And
Hmm.
that's something that really I think has changed the way the board interacts and the way the board, how they get things accomplished. It's just very, very different. And I miss that, but I guess people who've never experienced it don't miss that, you know.
So this gets to one of the other questions I have later on, but I'll ask it now. The changing dynamics of the generations, is that part of it? Is
Well, yeah.
is the millennials so much about Me Too and that there's not that much loyalty to the organization?
Those are loaded questions, Ted. Um,
Told you to be
well,
careful.
well, clearly, the younger pharmacists that are part of the council approach things a lot differently than we did when we were that age. I think one of the things that there's probably a lot of things that contribute. Of course, all the millennial, Gen X, all that stuff, and how it's different, and the priorities and what they are looking to get out of professional organizations is very different than our generation and the generations before us. But I think another big factor is, and you as well had it as I did. We had mentors that really forced us to not only get involved, but to really understand the value of like what the organization can do for you. And that's part of why I think this generational gap exists. I'm not sure, and that's on like me and maybe our generation, right? We didn't do the same thing that people like Bernie and Kurt and Marvin and others did to promote not only the council but promote us as leaders in the future of
Mm-hmm.
the
Yeah.
organization. Maybe we've fallen a little short there. Of course, many things have happened in those 20, 30 years, right? There's been a lot of changes in the world, um, the way we all do business, the economy, everything. So it's hard to say what really was the reason for that, but I do feel like there is a generational divide, um, that may be partially the council's fault in the way in which we do things now. Another example, right, is that when we got involved with the council, it was almost as if it was a big feather in your cap to like get appointed to certain committees, right? It's like there was
Mm-hmm.
competition to be on the assembly committee. There was competition to be in the professional affairs committee. It was sort of something many people aspired to. And we came onto these committees as junior members, learned the ropes, and became the leaders of those committees, and then got to board positions. So that hierarchy and those training ground opportunities are also have been very much missing in the last 20, 25 years, in my opinion. And so all of those things affect how our current leaders of the organization approach the council. They don't have the same, I think, level of involvement, interest, um, mentorship necessarily that we had. So it's different. It is very different. And I do think though that a lot of it is the council's fault and the leadership over, I'll take as much blame as anybody else, but I think we could have done a better job. So and again, the other thing you mentioned, right, is our I look at pharmacy graduates today, they want immediate gratification. They don't want to have to work for necessarily too hard to become successful, become um, assistant director, director. They just want it to happen, and they think that it should just happen by virtue of the fact that they're in the room. And I think it was harder for us. I think we paid our dues a lot more, than what is happening today. So it's some of that perhaps is generational, but again, I feel strongly that we maybe missed the boat a little bit.
Okay. Was there any major mishaps or issues when you were president, which would be useful to future presidents on not to
So
repeat?
yeah, I think we made some some mistakes early on with the hiring of the executive director. Um, Perhaps we were looking for something that didn't exist, or we wanted a kind of person out there that wasn't really there at the time. Um, so I think we struggled a lot with getting that established and went through a couple of executive directors. And there was also, not during my presidency, but the one or two after, we had some financial challenges with some of the staff who were doing some below the line kind of things with our money.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think those are lessons learned. I think the council did a great job in bouncing back and putting the checks and balances in place that I think we trusted certain people too much. Um, but yeah, so one of the things that I think we learned and have again righted righted the ship was to put those checks and balances in place so those kinds of things couldn't happen again.
Okay. Um, You were talking about the annual assembly. What was the first ones you remember and what were they like?
So, I mean, the first one I remember is obviously the one I went to when Marvin was installed as president back in the days. It was at the Concord. Um, Very different kind of place than what we are have been, using for the assembly for the last 20 or so years. Um, but it was, I think that there was a lot more tradition and um, a lot more pomp and circumstance associated with the assembly. I tried to, as when I chaired the assembly for a number of years, I tried to maintain that. Um, I think that since then we've lost some of that, so it's just not as important. Parts of the assembly are just not as important as they used to be to me. The
Hmm.
bank was such a big deal, standing room only, right? We had almost 1,000 people in that room. Um, it was the jewel of the crown for us. Um, the House of Delegates, of course, as well. I mean, the House of Delegates, I think we've maintained a good amount of that structure by virtue of what it is. But we have lost a bit, I think, around the focus on the council and the focus on um, how important that meeting is and how important the council is in the scheme of things. So I sense it's coming back a bit, but over the years we did lose some of that. I mean, the assembly was also, back in the day, right? We were able to do things um, with our pharmacy industry colleagues that we can't do anymore. So there was
Yes,
a lot of opportunity, right? You remember the early years, we had 10 hospitality suites happening on Friday and Saturday night, and you would just go from hospitality suite to hospitality suite, meeting all kinds of people from all different parts of pharmacy, lots of connections. That's something that really made the assembly, I think, a lot more fun for
hmm,
attendees, and it was a great way to, like I said, meet people and find. A lot of people use that as an opportunity to find their next job or branch out into an area of pharmacy that maybe was a little less traditional. So we've lost a lot of that. We've tried to do some things to make make it like it was, but I don't think it'll ever be like it was. Now I'm sounding like my mother, the good old
all
days.
right. Um, do you remember the assembly when you were president? And where
I
was it?
do. It was in Rochester, New York. Um, I remember the hotel, but it was in downtown Rochester.
Hmm.
Um, my parents were there. That was very special to me. I had, Montefiore at the time. I was director of pharmacy at Montefiore, and of course, they were very, very supportive and made it very, very special to me as well. Um, I presented my installation speech was the first time that anybody used a PowerPoint presentation for their speech. So that was memorable. And I remember, the concept I had was, I started my presentation with the regular kind of, the thank you to everybody. And then um, I had one of my friends, Rick Fichtel, off stage being the voice of like HAL 2000, the computer, interrupting me. But the concept there was, is our computers going to take over and replace pharmacists in the future? And what can we do if we don't think we want that to happen? What do we need to do, and how do we need to position ourselves? So my focus that year was really make 2000 the year to care instead of Y2K, year to care. And that was what was going to differentiate us, right, from computers, is the human touch, the pharmaceutical care concepts that were just starting to evolve into this patient-centered care model that we're experiencing now. But that was the focus of, my message, is that if we don't differentiate ourselves by what we can do in providing care to patients, we're going to go away. Thankfully, that has not really happened, although I think in many ways it has. If you look at some of the technology and automation that we have in place, um, and where is it going to go, right? Where is AI going to take us? Are we going to need physicians and or pharmacists in the future the way we use them now? Nurses are smart because the nurses are the only ones that still touch the patient, right? To that
Right.
extent. And so I think they're very well positioned for the future, but I'm not so sure that physicians and pharmacists have similarly done the same. So that was like the crux of where I was going. And then interestingly, soon after that, not soon, it was a decade later, I left Montefiore to, no, it wasn't a decade later. It was a couple of years later. Sorry. I left Montefiore to begin working in pharmacy, IT, and technology. So, I think part of what I wanted to do there was make sure that that prophecy didn't occur, that we still had pharmacists integral to the process. We could coexist in essence. And so that was sort of my mantra for the next 10 years of my career. But yeah, those are my memories of my assembly.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any other tidbits or nuggets of wisdom to impart to presidents and future presidents, etc.?
Now, is this going like into the time capsule?
I have no idea.
I mean, yeah, I do. I think, one of the things that's been really great for me, people like you and many others, is that we haven't um we've stayed connected to the council after our presidency. And I think it's really important to not only stay connected, but to stay involved. Like whether that's chairing committees, being involved with other kinds of initiatives that the council is doing. And for me, that's been very rewarding that I've continued to stay connected in many, many ways, in many different ways. So I would, advocate that it's a lifelong commitment. It's not just, you're on the board, you chair a couple committees, you're on the board, you president, and you disappear. That was never me. I think that was instilled in many of us that wasn't the way things were done. And so that's what I
Mhm.
would kind of advocate for, is that don't ever stop participating, showing your face locally, at the state level, nationally, wherever you might um, find your spot. But that's been really important to me, to maintain not only my relationship with the council, it keeps me current. Um, there's a voice for advocacy. I've developed a lot of friends and colleagues and people that I can call with a question if I have concerns or questions about anything. So that's probably my parting wisdom, is that don't ever walk away. Stay involved.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ted.
Yeah, with that, we would end our conversation.